one of the biggest things you can do is to work on your microbiome. Because if you're overweight to begin with, even after you lose the weight, you've had massive disruption of the gastrointestinal microbiome, but specifically an overproliferation of fecal microbes. Of course, your colon, when you go number 2 in the toilet, you're passing fecal material that came from your colon, from the rectal colon. Well, in people who've gained a lot of weight, even after they lose weight, they've had overproliferation of those fecal microbial species uh, that has ascended into the 24 feet of small intestine. So 24 feet of E. coli, Salmonella, Klebsiella. By the way, they may sound familiar because those are also the species of food poisoning. So those species are not good if they're in your French fries or hamburger from the fast food joint because the kid didn't wash his hands or he was using some utensil that had fecal contamination. Sadly, not that uncommon, right? So if you take that orally, you get very sick, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, etc. Same thing happens, though, when those fecal microbes didn't come in by way of tainted food, but came by way of ascending from the colon. And I estimate that 50% of the population of North America has this. Half the population has this. Small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. We say SIBO, S-I-B-O. And Jesse, if you said that to me a few years, I would have said, I don't think that's right. That seems like an exaggeration. But several things happened that have borne this out. One is the availability of this device called the AIRE device, A-I-R-E. That's the original. It measures hydrogen gas. This is a more recent one. And I have no relationship with the company. I know the inventor, Dr. Angus Short from Dublin, Ireland. He's an engineer, a PhD engineer. This is the more recent device, measures hydrogen gas and methane. You blow into it, and it registers a number 0 to 10 on your smartphone. Because microbes in the gastrointestinal tract produce these gases, but you cannot. So you can use these devices to map, to tell where microbes are living. There's a protocol you have to follow. You just can't test blindly, but it's very simple. It's in my Super Gut book, by the way, how to use the device. But there's a prep diet for about 12 to 24 hours, a diet free of any fibers, no alcohol, no plant matter, except for green leafy vegetables, nothing with fiber in it. That of the fiber of the sort digestible by microbes. Then you test baseline next morning, and then you consume some that microbes metabolize. We use inulin powder, for instance, a fiber, and test every 30 to 45 minutes. And if there's a rise within the first 90 minutes, you know microbes, fecal microbes, are living in the upper gastrointestinal system, stomach, duodenum, jejunum, etc. But here's the thing. Why would microbes in the small intestine have effects like obesity or insulin resistance or dementia? Well, because the small intestine is very permeable normally, because that's where we absorb nutrients, amino acids, vitamins, minerals. But when fecal microbes have come to colonize the small intestine, these microbes don't live very long. They live for a few hours. So when you have trillions of microbes, fecal microbes living in the small intestine, living and dying in the space of a few hours, huge turnover. When they die, they leave their components, but specifically their cell wall components, something called endotoxin. That endotoxin enters the bloodstream because of the permeability of the small intestine. That's called endotoxemia. Endotoxemia, major driver of weight gain, myosteatosis, muscle loss. So you can imagine if all you did was do a gastric bypass or took a GLP-1 agonist that reduces appetite, you've done nothing for this major driver of weight gain, insulin resistance, myosteatosis. So that has to be addressed. And by the way I address it, you could address it with antibiotics. But Jesse, if antibiotics are a big part of the reason that got us here, if you take an antibiotic, it's very common to gain about 8 to 10 pounds in the first few weeks after the antibiotic, reflecting the major role that bowel microbes play in regulating weight and fat and other aspects of metabolism. So we know that the gastrointestinal microbiome plays a big role in your shape and body composition. So if you take an antibiotic, you could push it back for a little bit, but antibiotics got us here. So I have a very hard time believing that antibiotics are part of the solution. So I asked these questions, Jesse. I said, well, okay, if you have this problem, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth with fecal microbes, what if you just took a probiotic? Will it go away? No. Might push back a little bit, might reduce some bloating, but it won't kill off 24 feet of trillions of microbes. So I asked this question: what if we chose microbial species that colonize the small intestine, which is unusual? Most microbes don't do that. That is, most beneficial microbes don't do that. Pathogens do, fecal microbes do. But what if we chose beneficial microbes that colonize the small intestine and produce what are called bacteriocins, natural antibiotics, peptide antibiotics that kill the species of SIBO? So I chose 3: a strain of Lactobacillus reuteri, a strain of Lactobacillus gasseri, and the most recent recipe I modified a little bit since I wrote the Super Gut book. I replaced the Bacillus coagulans with Bacillus subtilis. So these are 3 microbes that either colonize or germinate. The spore former, the subtilis, germinates in the ileum, and then produce bacteriocins that kill fecal microbes. And so far, we've had a very surprising amount of success with this. Crudely estimate about 90% of people will normalize their hydrogen gas or get rid of whatever phenomena we could blame on endotoxemia. Now, I have clinical trials designed and ready to go. I'm just waiting for funding. We'll do that to formally show this. But Jesse, we're talking about something that looks and smells like yogurt that you make in your kitchen. We're not talking about removing your intestine or a nasty biologic drug that causes liver failure or opportunistic infections. We're talking about something that you have with blueberries and chia seeds. And also provides a long list of beneficial effects. So the threshold, the hurdle to doing this is extremely low. A little bit of hassle, a little bit of expense sourcing the microbes, but the issue is so small and so accessible that people are doing this, and we're seeing unexpected success.
Okay, a couple changes you've made. You mentioned that one switch of a microbe from Bacillus coagulans to Bacillus subtilis. Talk more about why you made that switch, because we've been emailing back and forth. We're always keeping in touch. And even about 6 months, a year ago, coagulans was still part of your recipe. So this is relatively new. Talk about why.
So coagulans is a very interesting microbe. So this should not reflect badly on coagulans. The reason for it was we did a bunch of assays. So one of the things we've done repeatedly is count the number of microbes. So part of a lot of this is getting sufficient counts. So for instance, the Lactobacillus reuteri, if you ferment that by itself, when you co-ferment a number of microbes, they compete with each other, so you get lesser counts. But let's just, for the sake of argument, say we fermented reuteri by itself, and we use 36 hours. We want to let the microbe double 12 times because it doubles every 3 hours. As you recall, microbes don't have sex. They just double themselves. So reuteri doubles every 3 hours or so at human body temperature. So we're going to let it double 12 times, 36 hours. When we count the number of microbes, there's a method called flow cytometry. It's a laser-assisted method of count, because we're talking about trillions of microbes. It's a lot to count. We get about 300 billion per half cup or 120 milliliter serving. So that's part of the reason I believe we're having such great success is we're boosting counts of microbes far beyond what you get, say, from a probiotic, because microbes are very costly. If you're going to make a probiotic, you'll see commercial probiotics typically have 1 billion, 2 billion, 10 billion, sometimes more. The reason I limit the number is it's very expensive to make these things. So we're going to use a low count, increase it by fermentation, in this case, by something that looks and smells like yogurt. It's not yogurt, by the way. And it's a very inexpensive way to boost counts hugely. So we did this with Bacillus coagulans and found it was very erratic and very unreliable in getting very high numbers in dairy. So in other words, if you were in a manufacturer, you wouldn't do it in dairy product. You would do it in some kind of what they say broth with controlled pH and osmolality and mineral content. Well, we're not going to do that in our kitchens. So I replace it with Bacillus subtilis, which is very easy to ferment, and it happens to be a champion at making bacteriocins. It's not uncommon for many strains to make about 7 different bacteriocins with a broad range of effect in killing those fecal microbes. So the subtilis just is just a little more reliable.
Got it. But results are similar.
But the results are either the same or better, I think. Now, we got to formally prove that. But it's very costly to do that because, we can't do it as yogurt. We have to do it in an encapsulated form. So we're going to have to put probably something like 100 billion per species, per strain in the capsules. So it's going to be a very expensive trial. And we're not pharma. We don't rip people off for billions of dollars to fund stuff. So we have to rely on our own internal resources to do these clinical trials.
In the show notes, we'll link up a blog post of yours, how to make this. But in a really general sense, let's give people the lay of the land. And again, in email, I was asking you because I was going to take this on and I wanted the best yogurt maker. You told me about the Louvelli, which I love. Start there and talk about other yogurt makers if there's any other ones that are good. And then let's go through the basic recipe.
Jesse, they're very simple devices. It could be a yogurt maker like Louvelli. It could be a sous vide, a slow meat cooker, basin or stick. You can get 2 kinds. It could be an Instant Pot. All you need is some device that can maintain a temperature. Most human-sourced microbes do best at about human body temperature. So 37 degrees Celsius, 98 or so degrees Fahrenheit. I say 100. Or 37, 38, just so it's easy to remember. Now, that's not true for all microbes. There are microbes that like room temperature. So, for instance, Lactobacillus plantarum, very interesting microbe, does fine at room temperature. I tell your listeners that because if you're going to ferment microbes, you have to be mindful at what. So if I said, Jesse, we're going to go sit in Death Valley and it's going to be 140 degrees, well, you're not going to survive. So different creatures, different species thrive at different temperatures. Same with microbes. Most of the microbes we're talking about are human body temperature. These are human-sourced microbes. I was at a beer brewing store, and they're telling me about how they brew their beers and their wines. They use species like Saccharomyces cerevisiae, a fungal species, sometimes Lactobacillus brevis, if you want to get some of the malt flavor out. And they asked me, well, what are you fermenting? And I said, well, human microbes. They were horrified. Jesse, they're like, what? No way. And it struck me, that's what we're doing. We're fermenting human microbes, whether it came from breast milk or originally, not the one we use, but fecal matter from colon, it comes from humans. And we're restoring microbes that we've lost because, it just takes one round of antibiotics, Jesse. Let's say you took clarithromycin for whatever reason, or doxycycline, whatever, common antibiotics. You have literally killed off hundreds of species, most of which will never return. So that's one course. And most people in North America have gotten 30 courses of antibiotics by age 40. In the U.S. alone, 650,000 prescriptions are written for antibiotics every day. Every day. So there's a time and place. Antibiotics are necessary. If you've got sepsis, if you've got urinary sepsis or pneumococcal pneumonia, you need an antibiotic. But as you know, a lot of people are just given antibiotics because they have a dry cough from a viral respiratory infection, or your child has sniffles. They're given an antibiotic, and sometimes the parent is to blame. Johnny has a dry cough. He needs an antibiotic. So there's massive overuse of antibiotics. One of the unintended consequences of that is loss of literally hundreds of species in the gastrointestinal tract. And by the way, in other microbiomes too, skin, mouth, vagina, prostate, airway. So we have decimated our microbiome. So what we're doing here in a lot of ways is restoring microbes that were lost because of our wild overexposure to antibiotics.
Okay, we're going to come back to the yogurt, but while we're in this talking about the negative impact of overuse of antibiotics, what are some of the other things in that realm we're doing or things in the environment that are decimating our microbiome, whether it be oral, skin, gut, and so on?
There's probably a lot of things. Unfortunately, there's only evidence for a handful of things because, when there's not a pot of gold in studying something, it's hard to get those studies done. So we have to rely on what we have, which is we know antibiotics, of course. We know that many food additives, but specifically preservatives. So preservatives are put in food to prevent, for instance, mold from growing in your baked products or your cheese or whatever. So preservatives are antimicrobial in your food and in you. So preservatives in food, potassium sorbate, sodium benzoate, long list of these chemicals. Emulsifying agents that keep food mixed, like ice cream. Ice cream is the worst. It's got typically 3 or 4 or 5 emulsifying agents like gelin gum, xanthan gum, carrageenan, polysorbate 80, carboxymethylcellulose. Salad dressings, because people want it to stay mixed, oil and vinegar, and probably a lot of other things, though the evidence is kind of skimpy. Chlorinated drinking water, other drugs, stomach acid blocking drugs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen and naproxen, birth control pills. In other words, we all swim in a sea of factors that have disrupted the microbiome. But it's the antibiotics that are the worst, and this is as well as all those other things. That's why when we study indigenous populations, hunter-gatherers in the Brazilian rainforest or the savanna of Africa or the mountains of New Guinea, they all have very different microbiomes. They have far more species than we do. They have different species. And by the way, interestingly, they all have microbiomes that look almost identical to each other, even though they're separated by oceans and thousands of miles. And so presumptively, they have the microbiome of the Stone Age, of the Paleolithic human. That is the period before we had antibiotics, chlorinated drinking water, food preservatives, other food additives. Glyphosate is ubiquitous now. It's in virtually all foods. It's in our water. It's in the air, other herbicides, other pesticides. In other words, we're surrounded by these things. It's probably like avoiding microplastics. You really can't do it completely. All you and I can do, and all your listeners can do, is try to minimize our exposure. But sadly, in the modern world, we can't avoid them altogether.
Earlier, I mentioned a couple different areas I've seen you change your ways when it comes to the SIBO yogurt, one being that microbe switch. Another thing I've heard you talking about lately is fermenting the different microbes separately. It seemed like initially it was a co-ferment, and now I'm seeing you pivot away a bit from that. So talk about when somebody would want to ferment them together versus separately.
So if we ferment the rotari by itself, we get something like, as I mentioned, 300 billion per 120 milliliter serving. It's kind of like your backyard garden, Jesse. So if all you and I did in our, let's say, 10 by 10 plot was grow tomatoes, you're going to have a lot of tomatoes at the end of the growing season. But what if you grew tomatoes and cucumbers and watermelon and squash and zucchini? How many tomatoes will you have? Far fewer. Same principle. So when you co-ferment microbes, they compete with each other, and you're going to have fewer. We have not performed a count. You have to do DNA sequencing with flow cytometry to get the final composition of your yogurt. But I will say, the original formula, rotari, gastari, coagulans, did work. It worked great, despite some of the difficulties with coagulans. But we have not performed a relative count. And I'm seeing more and more people with really, really bad SIBO. These are people who say things like, well, I took antibiotics for 3 years for Lyme disease, or I took doxycycline for 2 years for my acne, or whatever. They took antibiotics repeatedly or chronically. They have massive disruption. And I found that if you individually ferment these microbes, you get higher counts of each microbe, and you get, I think, some increase in potency against these really bad cases of SIBO. So it's still fine to co-ferment, but if you think you're a person who's got really bad SIBO because of your history of antibiotic exposure, or you've had something that signals a really bad case, histamine intolerance would be one example of a really bad case of SIBO. Intolerances to other food, FODMAPs, nightshades, fructose containing foods, legumes. If you say, a lot of people say this, I have a list of 8 foods I can eat. I can't eat anything else. That's really severe SIBO. So if you're in that group, it might be better to individually ferment to get much higher counts. Because it's like an army, right? If you're going to go up against an army of 100,000 soldiers and you start the battle with 1,000 of your own soldiers, you're going to lose, right? So you want to go to battle with sufficient numbers.
Okay, good to know. I've always co-fermented. I've always used the coagulants up until now. I just ordered the Bacillus subtilis. I think it's the HU58. So I'm going to swap that in next batch and swap out the coagulants and see how it turns out. But just trying to get a lay of the land here, different ideas for people in different ways. You've seen people do this that have worked.
Oh, yeah. And the coagulants, so as I said, I wouldn't take this as a bad reflection on coagulants. It's a very interesting microbe. I used it a lot with my daughter, for instance. She retired, but she was a professional tennis player and had a bunch of injuries, oddly. And she'd have to take time off. When she came back, she found that she lost her ranking. And when you lose your ranking, you have to start from scratch and you have to qualify to play at Wimbledon, US Open, all that stuff. So she'd have to go through qualifying rounds. Well, in the main draw, you play every other day typically. In qualifying rounds, you play every day. So here these ladies are playing often in 90-degree weather, 2 or 3 hour long matches. You're exhausted. You're beat to heck at the end of your match. You got to do it again tomorrow. You're sore and beaten up. And then if you win it, got to do it again. And only then to get to the main draw. So there's a major disadvantage having to qualify. Well, one of the interesting effects of coagulants, if we believe the evidence, is a dramatic reduction in muscle injury during strenuous exercise. So if somebody runs a marathon, for instance, and we measure what's called creatine kinase, it's a measure of muscle breakdown. When they cross the finish line, there's about a 10 to 30-fold increase in muscle breakdown proteins measurable in the bloodstream. That's why some marathoners or triathletes will pee brown. That's muscle. They're peeing muscle. In extreme degrees, it's called rhabdomyolysis, and that can actually be very dangerous for you. But if you get coagulants, if we believe the evidence, it cuts your muscle breakdown by about 50%, meaning someone like my daughter, she'll still be sore and tired, but less so when she has to re-exert herself. So the coagulants is still very interesting, reduces pain from arthritis, has all kinds of beneficial effects. It just happens to be not very happy in a dairy medium.
Given there's different ways of making this, and now one of the microbes is switched, so people might be using a different microbe for that third one there, do we have any idea macro composition of the final product when it comes to carbs, protein, and fat?
We've not done an analysis, but we know that the process of fermentation, particularly our extended fermentation, so unlike yogurt you buy in a store that's been fermented typically a few hours, we're going to ferment for this extended period, and that maximally converts the lactose, that's the carbohydrate, the sugar of dairy. It maximally converts the lactose to lactic acid. So a lot of your listeners who've made this will say it's very tart. And if we test the pH, it's typically 3.5, which is 10-fold more acidic than conventional yogurt. So it's very acidic from the accumulation of lactic acid. So there's virtually no lactose. We've not done a formal analysis, but we know from fermentation and the evidence that there should be next to no lactose. For that reason, a lot of people who have lactose intolerance are fine with this extended fermentation yogurt. And people who have issues with casein, the risk may be reduced because that level of acidity, 3.5 pH, also denatures or breaks down the casein protein, particularly the casein beta A1 that's prevalent in North America. And so people are less likely to have immune type responses to that casein. So we haven't eliminated all the issues with dairy, but I think we've minimized them.
And your recommendation when it comes to consuming this, at least for the protocol, is half a cup a day. Any reason we can't go well beyond that? I find for myself, I love the taste, and if I'm hungry, I want to have more than that. Any disadvantage to consuming more than that half cup?
My I just made that up, Jesse. There's no science behind it, but my reasoning was this. We know that dairy has issues. Now, we've minimized some of the issues, but despite the prolonged fermentation, the acidity, all that stuff, there's still some hormones in there. There's still some other proteins that are not denatured that may have immune consequence. The risk is low. The whey protein is still there. That's the watery part. The whey protein has what's called an insulinotropic effect. That is, it provokes insulin. So, as your listeners will recall, it's sugars and carbs that trigger insulin. Proteins typically don't. The exception is whey. Whey, it does provoke insulin. So some people will have their weight loss blocked or even gain a modest quantity of weight when they're exposed to the whey. So if someone's concerned about that, it's easy to pour off when it separates, or you can make a Greek-style yogurt where you take your yogurt, you put it in a strainer lined with cheesecloth or a coffee filter, and then put that in some larger vessel, cover it, let that go for anywhere from 4 to 8 hours or so, and you'll see the whey drain out. You can either discard the whey, or some people save it in an ice cube tray and use that as your starter for future batches. That's one way to minimize that whey effect. But so there are issues with dairy, and so I was mindful of that. So I said, yeah, maybe don't overdo the dairy, but it's a very, very soft cutoff, Jesse. You can easily go more than that.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
When you lose weight by cutting calories, your basal metabolic rate drops by about 25%. And for all practical purposes, it's permanent. Study after study has shown if you cut calories...